Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War Frontline update for the 4th of September 2024. First time we've done 2 consecutive days of Frontline updates for an awful long time. Okay, if you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please check out the key on the screen at the moment. Pause the video. Right, let's go to first Kursk, the incursion or invasion really into Russia from the Ukrainian Sumy Oblast, where the Ukrainians have had limited success really over the last, I guess week. It's been a lot slower, and we'll look at the Institute for the Study of War, American military think tank, to get a sense of some of the anecdotes, but we'll also include a few bits on Kursk. So, Ukrainian President Zelensky has said that around 60,000 Russian troops have been redeployed away from the front lines in Ukraine to Kursk Oblast, Russia, in response to the Ukrainian incursion. So the claim is 60,000 troops have gone to help defend Kursk. So that's why you're going to see a largely static front line there. It also means that certain other areas, such as perhaps, I don't know, an example might be Cheziv Yar, have slowed down for the Russians, although Pokrovsk and Toretsk have been difficult for the Ukrainians. Actually, there's a bit of stabilization there over the last few days. Cheziv Yar is a place where we haven't really seen any meaningful gains for the Russians, as they are kept on the eastern side of the canal there. Now, there are some claims that the Ukrainians have actually pulled some troops from Cheziv Yar down to Pokrovsk. So they're doing a bit of reshuffling. Everyone needs to defend against these aggressive actions. So the Ukrainians need to get troops to Pokrovsk, but they don't want to take away from Kursk. And the Russians want to take troops from somewhere to support Kursk, but they don't want to take from Pokrovsk. So you're getting these desperate moves from either side as they try and maintain a decent enough defense in Kursk and Pokrovsk area. Right. Spokesperson for the Ukrainian brigade operating in Cheziv Yar direction said that Russian infantry units are now attacking in very small groups of between 2 and 8 personnel. So they are, doing much smaller infantry assaults, tiny really, compared to probably what they need to do if they have serious intentions in taking Cheziv Yar by the end of summer. Oops, no, that hasn't happened, of course. The end of summer has been and gone. So that's an interesting one, because there were so many, including the Ukrainian commanders themselves, thinking that Ukraine was going to have to cede Cheziv Yar to the Russians. Of course, that never happened. But then they probably did a bit of reactive switching, reacting to the weakness in Pokrovsk that eventually came about, and Toretsk and New York, areas where they opportunistically took advantage. And so Cheziv Yar, I think, took a bit of a backseat as well. As that, they then, as mentioned, troops from Cheziv Yar may have been pulled away to Kursk. So, okay. A Ukrainian officer said that Russian forces are now just 8 kilometers from Pokrovsk. We'll get there later. To entice civilians in occupied Kherson to join the Russian military, the occupation authorities are offering a signing on bonus of around $4,600 and a minimum monthly salary of $2,400. So that's fascinating, because it means that the Russians really are desperate. They are in dire straits, needing to get as many troops as possible. They are trying to give a hugely attractive sum of money to those signing up, those Ukrainians signing up in the occupied Kherson region who might want to have some money and fight for the Russians against their countrymen. So there is that. Now, interesting that on the frontline summary, so many of these places are showing no advances at all. So we'll look at that on the map. This is the ATP Geopolitics distilled version of the Institute for the Study of War summary. That's on my website there. That's linked in the description below. that gives you a really distilled version of the ISW summary. Anyway, going to Kursk, so no real movement there, no mapping changes for either the mappers. If we go to War Translated, Dmitry from War Translated, we hear an anecdote that a Russian is complaining in this video that there's no one at the checkpoints 20 to 30 kilometers from the front line in the Kursk region. I don't know what that tells you, but there are issues with the organization of Russian defensive forces in these areas. There's heavy looting. I think it's a bit chaotic, but they clearly have got enough troops now there to stop the Ukrainians. Ukrainians are fighting over several places still, but the opportunities are not going to be available to the Ukrainians for that much longer. In fact, we do hear that. Let's go to Nor Report's daily thread from the Kursk region. A small window of opportunity is left. Military expert Alexei Hetman explained that the advance of the Ukrainian forces in the Kursk region has slowed because Russian troops are regrouping and reinforcing their positions to prevent further progress. He compared the situation to a window of opportunity that might only remain open for 2 to 3 weeks. And I generally agree there. What else can be said? Interesting anecdote here. Russian man has switched sides to the Ukraine in the liberated part of Kursk region, sharing his thoughts on his new life. He said, "I want all of Russia to be like this without Putin." So obviously not a big fan of Putin. Join the Ukrainians there. Situation in Koronovo in Kursk region still in Russian hands, but, quote, "there is nothing left of it at all. Sorry for swearing, but everything is effed up. There is nothing left from the market that was here." So Koronovo has been the scene of a lot of intense fighting. The Ukrainians were looking to flank Koronovo. That doesn't seem to have happened. They have made some progress to the south and a little bit to the north as well, but they haven't seriously encircled Koronovo. Fighting on the outskirts there doesn't seem to have been any further progress, although, as mentioned there, that the claims are that Koronovo is not in a good way. It's not a massive place, but it's fairly sizable, and yeah, there is serious fighting on the outskirts there. Now, I wonder whether the Ukrainians are going to be in a position to be able to take this land to the south of the same river, where we have seen a number of pontoon bridges and 3 permanent bridges taken out. No new news on that. There are these claims about unused brigades of Ukrainian troops. I wonder whether it's worth considering, putting a force up into this area from the southern border, coming along from the east and possibly coming along from the west as well, although there's a river here that is in fact the same river going through Tekhino, so it'd be quite difficult to cross it there. But they kind of have control of this land there, which was part of, that is Russian territory there. But yeah, that's just my speculation that they could do that if they did have any spare capacity. It would be a waste not to take this land because you've got the river that would give you natural protection if you want to hold on to this land. So Zelensky, remember, said they are looking to hold the areas in Kursk indefinitely. So these are going to be important negotiating tokens, really, and the more land they can get that land to the south of the same, it will be easily defended, or more easily defended, and it will be very useful for them. So I don't know if that's on the cards. Anyway, no change to the Kharkiv sectors. They've been basically in stasis since the Kursk invasion started, and that's because the Russians have taken troops from there, and the Ukrainians probably don't have too many troops to spare themselves. Then from Kupiansk to Svatova to Crimea, no change to the front line at all there either. No confirmed changes, says the ISW. No confirmed changes, they claim, until you get down to Toretsk. But we are going to pop into the northern part of the Bakhmut Soledar sector. This is sort of the bottom of the Seversk front line. We have seen the Russians make some fairly decent gains over the last month or so in the Spurna area, trying to get towards Seversk. They are actually getting, if you believe Surat maps, they are getting somewhat closer there, and it's a bit of a worry. Now, there was this weird situation where Andrew Perpetua had more land occupied by the Russians than Surat maps did, to the side of this railway track passing past Perezhne. Anyway, he has taken that back today, so possibly some well, almost certainly some evidence to suggest that they don't actually control that, the Russians. I don't know that that's necessarily going to be a counterattack or anything in the last 24 hours, possibly a rejig. And on the other hand, has the Russians controlling a little bit more just along this railway line than previously suggested. So a slight rejig around that whole area, but doesn't have the Russians in the same control zone as Surrey Maps has up along this settlement on the eastern side of western side of the railway. Anyway, that's all north of Roslivka there. No changes to the Chasiv Yar front line for either of the mappers, and I think that's pretty significant. And then we come on down to, first of all, Toretsk and then the Pokrovsk front. So the good news for the, I need to change the colour of those. Those should be red, not blue. So that's annoying, although one of them is blue. I'll change that in a second. But other than that, no change in the last 24 hours to the Pokrovsk front line for either of the mappers. And that's definitely good news. So there seems to be some certain stabilization there. There is a little bit of change here to Toretsk. So if we go to what Surrey Map says about Toretsk, the Russians have captured new areas in Druzhba. News about the complete capture of the locality by Russian forces not true. So obviously some rumours that they've captured the whole of Druzhba. Well, to be honest, according to Surrey Maps, they pretty much captured most of it. There are these other roads, though. But yeah, the main part there, increasingly under Russian control, just north of the railway line as it skirts past the north of Toretsk. No change to Toretsk. Great news for the Ukrainians there, and no change to the New York area. But all, fairly challenging for the Ukrainians in this general area. I just don't know. Oh, I've moved some polygons there. Going to have to look at that. Anyway, so we have the claim that the Ukrainians have pulled in some troops from the Chasiv Yar area to Pokrovsk. So Chasiv Yar just up there. A lot more stabilized, pulling some troops into Pokrovsk. The claim here, it appears that Ukraine has redeployed elements of the 93rd Mechanized Brigade from Chasiv Yar to the Pokrovsk front. According to Rob Lee, going back to some geolocated evidence to suggest that. It's worth understanding that Pokrovsk itself, as the city or town, has been absolutely hammered. So Russians have, says JNK, totally destroyed the town of Pokrovsk with artillery-guided bombs and missile strikes. Now they'll have to move in and call it Russia. That's Putin's plan for all of Europe. The kind of destroy, then liberate. Of course, liberate is in scare quotes. So Pokrovsk getting hammered from a distance there, but the Russians are not far away from there. It is another thing entirely to take Pokrovsk. They are taking these fields and whatnot. I don't know whether the Russians will have the capacity to take Pokrovsk, but they've certainly done a whole lot of territorial gaining in this area, and it is worrying for the Ukrainians, and especially as the Ukrainians seem to be grinding to a stop in the Kursk region. Okay, Pokrovsk direction here is just footage of a Ukrainian tank supported by BMPs destroying Russian positions and buildings with occupiers in them. Now, I'm not going to show you this, nothing particularly amazing, other than we are starting to see a little bit more of this. We had a good few weeks of not much footage of the Ukrainians doing any kind of serious damage to the Russians in defending. What we've previously seen, and we're seeing this, for example, down in this neck of the woods, further to the south, we are seeing the Russians attack with fairly large, I say fairly large compared to the last sort of 5 months or so, not compared to the beginning of the war, but fairly large mechanized assaults. And the Ukrainians are giving them a right bloody nose. The Russians are still losing large numbers of vehicles and equipment. We haven't really seen that too much in Pokrovsk. The Russians have just been overwhelming the Ukrainians far more easily there. So starting to see some footage like this coming out just anecdotally and a bit of speculation on my behalf, makes me wonder whether the Ukrainians really are putting up a bit more of a fight in the general cross direction. So when we come down past Seladove, where there's no change to the mapping there, but there's a lot of fierce fighting going on in Seladove, Ukrainians putting up more resistance there than they had done in places like, for example, Novohrodivka, that they kind of rolled over and allowed the Russians to take that. A little bit of rejigging for Suryat maps in this area by Ukrainsk and just south of Memrik, where Suryat maps previously had the Russians in control of this whole area, but not at the moment, but has had the Russians making some gains further to the east of there, just north of Zeleno Persia. But actually, considering that's the sum total of their gains in the Pokrovsk area for today, that's not too bad at all. Not too shabby, you might say. Now, the Suryat maps indication here is slightly different, and that's because it's taking into account yesterday's adaptations, which I added that to the map yesterday. So this is, I think, bringing 2 days together. So it says here that the Russian army entered the localities of Lysivka and Zeleno Persia due to the proximity of the Russian troops to the last supply line to the western front of Donetsk city. The Ukrainian army began a withdrawal to the west, which allowed the Russian forces to take control of a significant area of the front, which includes the last section of the 2014 defensive line, as well as a settlement of Novelska. I talked about that yesterday, how, Novelska, I always think, was this holdout place that the Ukrainians had that stopped the Russians from flanking Pervomaisky, which kept Avdiivka under the Ukrainian control. Well, unfortunately, that's long gone now, and we're much further to the west. Anyway, so some gains for the Russians there. Then as we move further to the south, you can see no change to Marinka area, no change to Konstantinivka, which is good, but along that highway that connects, or that main road, the artery that connects Vuhledar to Konstantinivka, the Russians are making some gains. They're pushing into Vodyany according to Suryat maps. Remember, not so much according to Andriy Perpetua yet, but it may be that he follows suit. So the Russians gaining this long, thin bridgehead into the south of Vodyany and some fields to its east, and then another field over here further to the northeast. That's really worrying. No news about the fighting going on at the mine there to the northeast of Vuhledar. And then the Russians making further gains at this area, this neck of the woods, which is I'm probably going to butcher this. In fact, I'm not even going to say it at all because Google Maps isn't having none of it. But we'll put it on the map here. So Suryat map says situation on the Zaporizhzhia front during the last 5 days. Russia's taken control over new positions northeast of Robotna. No, that's not the one. Goodness me, Pierce, sorted out. The Russian army made new advances towards Vodyany, reaching the southern outskirts of the locality. Moreover, Russian forces took full control over Prechistivka, and that's where we have it there. So actually going back to where Suryat maps was talking about, we have had... So we come out of them. That's both mappers believing that the Russians now have control of that whole settlement to the southwest of Vuhledar, almost to the west, really. Then when we come past Velika Novoselka sector, that hasn't changed, but the Robotna area has had considerable change, as according to Suryat maps. There's a really big difference here between the two mappers, but Suryat maps has the Russians fully in control of Robotna and actually equalizing the line quite considerably. It is not quite at the May the 30th starting point from before the Ukrainian counter-offensive last summer, but it's not far off, right? The difference between the two mappers here, so Suryat maps has the Russians some, 3.5 kilometers further to the north than Andriy Perpetua does. He would probably be saying that this is fairly chaotic grey zone, but you may see his mapping change to reflect Russian movements to the north if that is justified. So that's the front line today. It is a case of the Ukrainians now not having the momentum and the initiative from Kursk, which was always going to happen. So this isn't any kind of major surprise. They're not going to be allowed to just romp on all the way through the Kursk Oblast ad infinitum, right? The Russians were always going to stop them. It's at what point and at what cost to the Russians. So the Russians have then brought in, supposedly, as mentioned, 60,000 troops from elsewhere, including Africa, internally in Russia, as well as frontline areas, Kherson, Zaporizhia. We've heard from Kharkiv as well, and possibly from the northeast. I don't know for sure though. So they have the Ukrainians forced the Russians to do that. On the other hand, the Russians have been doubling down on areas like Toretsk and Vuhledar, causing the Ukrainians to lose an awful lot of territory, though not as much as the Russians have lost in Kursk. So we'll see now what happens. Will the Ukrainians keep the forces that they have concentrated in Kursk, which they're still on the offensive up there, but it is not moving at the speed it was? Will they keep those forces in a defensive mode up here, or will they be able to dig in, need fewer soldiers to work these lines defensively, pull back some of those units and then place them elsewhere on the front line? Or will they continue to plug away at attempting to take more ground in Kursk? I suppose the next week or so will give us an indication of what their objectives are up there, those further objectives they might have, because I think they've already achieved a lot of what, and I've discussed this in other videos on Kursk, so I'm not going to repeat myself here, but I think it's been a successful invasion. It didn't pull the troops away from Pokrovsk, but it did achieve some strategic objectives, some operational objectives, and I think it was good for morale, and it did hammer the Russian morale and PR. But as we said so often along the way, it's like, and then what next? So we're in the kind of what next stage. Anyway, thanks for watching. Really appreciate your support. Take care, guys, and speak to you soon.